Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Doom Scroll News Report here on Radio Taiwan International, where I, Hannah Belinsky, and my co-host,
Amanda Stevens,
two writers, political by necessity, cover some of the biggest international news stories dominating our news feeds from the last week. I'm Hannah Belinsky, and this week we're laying out a bit of a smorgasbord, starting with U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stirring the pot, NPR versus the Trump administration, and an issue that Amanda and I are admittedly not the best sources for balanced and objective commentary: abortion rights. I've saved that for last, knowing we're both kind of chomping at the bit to get into it. Yes. I've always liked your coat hanger tattoo on your finger, Amanda. I know you said people tend to assume it means you're into sewing or some such, but yes. I knew what it meant right away, and I'm about it.
Yeah, I have gotten a lot of comments. I got it in Taiwan after Roe v. Wade was overturned. A friend of mine and I...
Oh, was that recent?
Yeah, we had an impulsive moment of anger and not able to do anything, being in the wrong country, and then I'm in the wrong state. Well, I'm in the right state, I guess, but it felt like I was in the wrong state. So we made sort of an impulsive decision to get it done. I wanted something more permanent because, as we were saying while we were raging and screaming in a cafe angrily, like, I'm not going to really change my opinion at any point in time.
Yeah.
And I want to try to be open-minded on a lot of different topics. I want to try to be like, I can see where you're coming from. But on the whole, I don't agree with most of it, and I'm glad it's the last thing we're talking about, because otherwise we would go insanely over time and have to cut everything else out of the script. So
no, I completely understand.
It's very strategic of you.
Before we get into the fun stuff, I want to be sure and cover U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's latest comments, because it does pertain directly to our current place of residence here in Taiwan. Hegseth on May 31st said in a speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue Defense Summit in Singapore that China poses an, quote, imminent threat to Taiwan. This deviates significantly from their usual rhetoric when it comes to this particular topic. The Economist raised the most pertinent questions, namely the main one I want the answer to, which is, does he even know what he's talking about?
I ask that every time I see his name in the news.
I mean, living and working in Taiwan, we can say firsthand that certainly China seems to have been ramping up intimidation tactics and gray zone harassment, between the large-scale military drills, the airspace incursions, the dragging of anchors across our submarine cables, and the pro-reunification Chinese spouses, and the random landings by Chinese guys in toy boats.
I was going to say, don't forget what we talked about last time.
Clearly, there's quite a lot going on, and we report on their shenanigans regularly in the newsroom. Anyone can see that they have been extra cranky since President Lai was elected, and they have been making their displeasure known.
Loudly.
But I don't believe they're about to make their move. And crucially, there's no intelligence that they're about to do anything either. Whether Hegseth actually has any idea about the reality of the situation, I think this guy talking tough on it isn't going to make things any better. I imagine it played well on Fox News back when he was a host, and now he's just carrying the bit over to politics because that's just what he knows how to do. By the way, did you know that about this guy, that he was a Fox News personality before he was given control of the Pentagon?
I have. This is one of the only things that I want to talk about, and this is still not the right time to talk about it, but the way in which I don't think he's qualified for any of these things, I cannot overstate it. I feel like it's somebody who took a couple of biology classes in college and they walk around calling themselves a doctor. Like, you don't, it's not that you have nothing. He did serve in the military, but like that doesn't make you qualified to lead the military. He served during the Iraq War. If that was the only qualification, hundreds of thousands of Americans would be qualified to lead. To lead the department that he does.
I mean, when he was appointed, it did come out of left field. It's kind of very obvious that Trump installed him because he liked how he talked about him on Fox News.
Yes, and he still likes him, and that's why he still has a job, even after all of the Signalgate stuff. But
Can I say something that may be lookist of me? He looks like a Bond villain.
Lookist.
I that's the thing, right? Yeah. But like he looks like a Bond villain. The slicked back hair, the heavy brow bone.
I think it's because he dresses up like he's a TV host everywhere he goes. But I mean, like everywhere, every time that I see him somewhere, it is like he is about to be hosting his own segment on TV. And it plays well when you are a TV host, but you're not a TV host everywhere.
He seems like a real piece of work. I didn't know that much about him before, besides the Signal
I wish
fiasco.
I didn't.
But a quick visit to this guy's wiki page revealed that he was the publisher and editor-in-chief of his alma mater, Princeton University's conservative newspaper, and that during that time, he published an editorial describing homosexuality as immoral, among other articles criticizing Black people and gay people. Happy Pride Month, by the way.
Happy Pride, but not from this guy.
Not from this guy.
Not from this guy. Listen, we said we were going to keep it on track. Does he know what he's talking about? No, I don't think he's credible. I think a lot of his stances are born out of his infotainment TV days. And I truly mean that.
Yeah. It really goes to show you can't trust every Ivy League graduate, you know?
No, you went to school at a very nice place. It doesn't mean that it sunk in. I think all of his his anti-China rhetoric and I think his alarmism, I really sincerely think it is born out of being a Fox News host and just speaking to the masses and getting stuff that is a big attention grabber. And I think he doesn't have the policy experience to back any of this up because he doesn't have any policy experience. He never served in government before. He served in the military. But again, we've already been over that. That just means that you know how to take orders. It doesn't mean that you know how to be a good leader. With a lot of the Trump administration, I think a lot of this anti-China rhetoric actually isn't born out of much, if any, political stratagem. I think it's just born out of kind of like a blind hatred.
I think it's just posturing.
Of the other.
Yeah.
And then in this case, it happens to be China.
Well, let's get into what he actually said. Per Idrees and Yong reporting for Reuters, at the same time, Hegseth is asking Asian allies to spend more than the average 1.5% of GDP currently going to their defense budgets. He's basically waving Europe away from the Indo-Pacific, suggesting that European allies should focus on security in their own continent so that America can focus on this side of the world. And this flies in the face of what America's military leaders quietly support, as Europe's presence in the region can only further deter China from taking military action. It can only be a good thing.
Did you even see how rudely he said it at the official Shangri-La?
Super embarrassing.
He said, quote, because I wrote it down, I was so shocked that he said, "We believe that the N in NATO stands for North Atlantic and that our European allies should maximize their comparative advantages on the continent," end quote.
He's basically saying butt out.
Insane.
On the one hand, I kind of get it because Europe would offer a little military assistance in the event of any regional war in Asia, and they have admitted as much. But to be honest with you, I also have less and less confidence in Uncle Sam. It goes back to what we were saying, where the anti-China rhetoric seems like a lot of show posturing, you know, and especially with Trump at the helm. Do your friends and family members back in the States reach out to you as often as ours reach out to us with their concerns about China?
More and more often, and this is even with none of my family is from Taiwan, but they have visited, so they even know what daily life is like in Taiwan. And to the extent that I think they have a pretty good common sense buffer about when to ask questions and then when they're assuming that it's just kind of media blowout. But I have been getting a lot more questions from them in recent years. I also, though, do think that, going back to the Europe in Taiwan, and also how insane it is. In my opinion, it's sort of even if somebody has little help, wouldn't you rather have a lot of little helpers than no one at all?
Yeah.
And then also the other speaker of import, besides Hegseth, unfortunately, was the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who, while he did admit they wouldn't be able to offer much military help in terms of they're halfway around the world, they don't really have strongholds over here in the way that the U.S. does, that they did, and they were in the process of forming an alliance so that they could crack down, and as a large deterrent group, right? So basically, what he said was something along the lines of we want to form a large wall so that nobody can be bullied by China and the United States, which was important because it goes back in my mind to some political analyst I remember discussing about Trump's view of world powers is that world powers like the United States, like China, like Russia, get to just do whatever they want and everybody else just has to fall in line.
Yes.
And I think that is sort of how the United States administration looks at this, and they look at them and China as the only two people in this conflict that are worth entertaining.
The big bullies.
Right. And then everybody else is just going to have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And get run over or listen to them, including the European countries who are, again, up until recently, some of our greatest political allies. So my family is worried about me, but I also think that it is insane that the United States through Hegseth, tragically, is kind of flaunting that will help while becoming increasingly isolationist and encouraging others to do the same. I don't think that's a safe world. I think that's a more and more radicalized world, to be less connected.
Well, let us pivot to something
we have a lot of expertise on.
Yes, something we have a lot of expertise on. Thank you, Amanda. That's a great transition. We'll be getting better at those, I promise. Working for the radio, we naturally follow the news on radio and public broadcasting. The latest bombshell is that NPR, that's National Public Radio, is suing Trump for cutting their funding.
Kind of a follow-up to our very first flagship episode.
That's right. So straight out of the horse's mouth, David Folkenflik, reporting for NPR, explains that NPR, alongside 3 Colorado public radio stations, have filed a lawsuit against the Trump White House in federal court over his executive order that blocks the use of federal funds for NPR and PBS. The executive order in question was issued early last month on the basis that, quote, neither entity presents a fair, accurate, or unbiased portrayal of current events to tax-paying citizens. Hello, First Amendment violation. NPR has assembled a legal team, including leading free speech lawyer Theodore J. Boutrous, who has a history of winning landmark cases before the Supreme Court and argued appeals in nearly all federal circuits. The thrust of their argument is that Trump is blatantly retaliating against public media for reporting truthfully on him, i.e. negatively. You know, one thing that's stuck with me since my Communications 101 courses and working for my university paper is that the concept of objective journalism itself tends to be inherently liberal. Is objective journalism possible? That's another debate altogether. But I do think that good, clean reporting, presenting the statistical facts to the masses, naturally tends to support liberal positions. The truth, as Stephen Colbert famously said at George Bush's 2006 White House dinner, has a liberal bias. Is this something you learned during your school days?
I don't think I remember ever distinctly learning it. Notably, I mostly studied creative writing. We're doing kind of the opposite of that, where you get to invent whatever you want.
Yeah.
But following that line, I think it is interesting, as somebody who did study like making stories, I think that is like an inconvenient truth. The worst person you know has a good point. Facts don't care about your feelings. Like,
yeah.
Either way, though. And I think that is like one of the big problems here, because that has been a problem consistently for both political parties in the United States. For the Democrats, when they were trying to like spin the last election and things just weren't really coming out, or even like the truth wasn't necessarily being spread in the same way.
The truth is kind of secondary to how you present it, especially in a theatrical kind of political scene like the United States has.
Yeah. And then compared to right now, we have a government in place that is trying to spin a very deliberate story. And when you have somebody who is any sort of broadcaster who's refusing to buy into that story and instead just report like what you see and what you hear, that's inconvenient for them. And it makes it hard for them to continue their narrative.
David Folkenflik additionally reported that PBS and a public television station in rural Minnesota are also filing suit as of May 30th, making similar allegations on the basis that the executive order is unlawful and oversteps his authority as president. I remember when the news first came out about Trump trying to pull the rug out from PBS, I remember half rhetorically asking my husband Aaron over dinner what the point was. And do they just hate children or something? Because the EO would strip $81 million in federal grants from PBS per year, the bulk of which just goes to running kids shows and Ken Burns documentaries. We both grew up on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and his songs are getting very heavy play in our house these days with the new addition to the family. Although, admittedly, it's been years since I've actually watched TV, I struggle to see what is really political about PBS unless it's just as simple as its programming being too pro-diversity for the GOP's tastes. When have they ever broadcasted anti-Trump propaganda?
I have two thoughts about this. But the first one is, in the filing, they said that sometimes it's hard to tell when something is retaliatory, but in this case, a wolf is clearly a wolf, to quote a late justice. But I think that's exactly what this is, because to me, I think that this is much more about the PBS news rather than the PBS content we see. And just as a little check, right before we went and recorded this, I went in and checked PBS News, because I know that I quoted them liberally literally when I was reporting on Gaza 2 weeks ago at this point, and the very first thing that pops up when you click on their news page is how Gazans are trying to dodge bullets while they are going through the new broken setup aid system. And going back into like not being able to spin a narrative, that is the kind of news that they respond to, or that they are reporting. Like they're out there trying to, as we were saying, the great thing about all of these other news organizations like PBS, Voice of Free Asia, all of these ones, they're out there trying to just report what they see.
Right.
And that is something that can't be controlled. And that, I think, is something that the administration has a big problem with, because
it feels so pertinent to be recording this June 4th. Yes. Those who know, know. So, yeah.
If you don't, look it up. Look what's important about June 4th and learn something.
That's right.
I do think that part of it is being a little bit too pro-diversity, because I think that that's a big fight that is not exactly this fight, but is another one that's going on in the United States right now, is like parents and people who don't have children but want to control the way that children are raised are
Culture war
upset
stuff
about having too much diversity or acceptance or just values that they don't think are important being taught to children in a way that they receive very well.
God forbid. Well, speaking of the children, let's move on to our final topic for this episode. Now, on to the topic we've all been waiting for, or, well, me and Amanda have been waiting for. If any listeners out there are interested in a pro-life viewpoint, I'm just going to tell you up top that this is not where you're going to find it, because truly beastly things are going on in the name of fetal personhood, and I just can't see it any other way. So, to better illustrate just what I mean when I say beastly, I just want to start with an update on Adriana Smith. I'm referencing an article by Carter Sherman writing for The Guardian. Ms. Smith is a woman from Georgia who is being kept alive despite being clinically brain dead in order to carry out her pregnancy. Georgia's state law stipulates that abortion is banned after 6 weeks of pregnancy. Smith was put on life support 8 weeks into her pregnancy, with doctors planning to deliver the baby via C-section in early August. However, the chances of the baby being healthy by the end of this ordeal is very, very small, and last month they noted he had fluid in his brain, so things are already looking pretty grim. Experts say he may be blind, unable to walk, or unable to even survive once he's born. And this is just the latest catastrophe of ethics in a slew of horrific stories about women suffering or dying unnecessarily while miscarrying because their doctors cannot legally perform a medically necessary abortion, or they're afraid to. A woman stripped of her dignity, reduced to a essentially non-sentient vessel for carrying a baby to term. It's nightmarish. Amanda, I know you want to talk about it, so please do.
Yeah, I mentioned upstairs, I was surprised that you brought this up only because I didn't know how much we were going to talk about it. But I think that this is kind of one of those, up until recently, it has actually always been postulated as a theoretical question. I know that there's a really famous question that I remember when people were debating the ethics of abortion about the violist or the cellist. If you had to stay in a room and give blood to somebody every day and you couldn't leave for like 9 months, but you could save the world's greatest cellist in the world. Like, would you do it? But this is essentially kind of like gets into a very sci-fi dystopian thing. And it's something that a lot of anti-abortion people are not really putting their name behind because they don't want to be associated with this, because it is nightmarish. Of course, in situations where there are terrible disasters and a woman is pregnant enough and has carried the baby so that the baby could possibly or potentially be saved, I think that that's a different conversation. Yeah. Right? And in most of those cases, also, it's the family's wish and it's the mother's wish that, like, please try to save my child. Right. And I see, like, sort of complicated layers in this. Totally. But this is way too early for that.
Yeah,
right?
8 weeks. I
8
mean,
weeks.
You don't even look pregnant.
Some people don't know that they're pregnant at 8 weeks. Like, that's insane. And then the family doesn't have a choice in this. They're not allowed to say anything into this. And so now to, like, drag out the life of somebody who, you know, is never going to come back, maybe even against her own wishes, it just boggles my mind every time that people would put the life of a child that sometimes isn't even a child at this point. I don't believe in fetal personhood, not to this degree, above the life of a woman who has already lived here and already exists and already has a family and wants and needs.
All I can imagine is how horrific it must be to be her family and have to bear witness to this.
Right.
Like, how do you mourn for someone who is in this strange in-between state.
You're kind of just turning her into a gestation tube.
It's terrible.
Which is like, again, this is a living person. This is a person who had wants, who had needs, who had her own will. And I don't know personally anybody who would want this for themselves.
I also want to take the opportunity to complain about Missouri, where I grew up and which has become an increasingly terrible state. For this, it's because I left, of course. For this, I'm referencing an article by David A. Lieb for AP. 6 months after Missouri voters were able to push an abortion rights amendment through, lawmakers approved a new referendum seeking to overturn it, banning most abortions with exceptions for rape and incest. Republican senators basically did some obscure procedural maneuvering to block Democrats from being able to discuss the issue in order to get the revision through, basically flying in the face of the will of the people under the guise of giving voters a second chance on abortion. It'll come up on the ballot in 2026, couched in such language as ensuring women's safety during abortions, ensuring parental consent for minors, allowing abortions for medical emergencies, fetal anomalies, rape and incest. It conveniently does not spell out a ban for all abortions from impregnation in every other case. Tell me, what is it like to grow up in a state that is not like this?
Well, we touched upon it very briefly in a related, though not the same thing, that I know I've talked about on a couple of shows.
Sex education.
Sex ed.
Yeah.
Yes, and sort of just open or at least more open information about that from an early age. But I would say the thing that I've been hearing more and more, and something that I think needs to get a little more attention than it is even if you live in a state where this isn't being challenged constantly, that doesn't necessarily mean that your rights are safe or the rights of those people around you are safe. Because as we've brought up, I think the last time that we were discussing a related issue, or actually it might have even been last week, the United States functions like a bunch of little mini states.
Yes.
Or sorry, mini countries. Right. That all agree on one set of federal laws and then otherwise kind of self-govern. But when it comes to something like this, unless this is like expressly written out as a right that you do have, it opens up the opportunity for a law like this one in Missouri to get challenged and then go up and then become a right that is banned nationally. And even sanctuary states like Washington State, where I grew up, or New York, are not necessarily safe. And actually, that is at the crux right now of the telehealth medicine, mifepristone, where New York is a sanctuary state. They're allowed to mail out mifepristone, which is a very safe and long-used abortion drug, to anybody who wants to. And doctors are protected in New York State. But having sent that to somebody in Texas, now Texas is trying to sue New York and trying to sue this doctor and get them disbarred. New York is not accepting it, and that is likely going to lead to this being taken up somewhere even faster, because we just said these states have to agree on respecting each other's laws to some degree, because otherwise that's not necessarily a country. So growing up in a state where it is a protected right doesn't necessarily mean that you're safe. So you brought up mifepristone. Before we wrap up, I want to highlight this analysis from the Washington Post written by Glenn Kessler on the study a think tank called the Ethics and Public Policy Center released last month about the dangers of this key abortion medication. The report, the so-called dangers. The report claims about 11% of 865,000 women prescribed mifepristone for abortions experienced a, quote, serious adverse event, versus the 0.5% rate found in clinical studies. I encourage anyone interested to just take a look at how the numbers comprising this percentage break down and form their own opinion. But I'd also like to note right off the top that the report wasn't formally peer-reviewed before publication. It's not, because it's not supported by all of the other information out there.
That's right.
So, of course, always we link what we read. Go read it for yourself. Make your own opinion.
I like this pretending I actually care about women's health remark about the report from Senator Josh Hawley for Missouri, explaining that these adverse health events are major, potentially life-threatening medical disasters like sepsis, infection, hemorrhaging, not even getting into what percentage of women experience these events after taking mifepristone. Would you like to know what else is dangerous and can cause potentially life-threatening medical emergencies?
Hannah, what could that be?
Being pregnant, giving birth, being postpartum.
Especially without healthcare.
The fact of the matter is pregnancy is scary. So
Yeah.
even just disregarding the junk science aspect of this, Holly's fake concern is so grating. Oh no, pill have side effect. Okay, baby have side effect.
So often when it comes specifically to the idea of abortion, a really insidious way that the patriarchy and those who are trying to keep it intact try to package it is out of concern for women's health.
Yeah.
But that is never actually the case, because when we get into like what is actually useful for women's health at this point in time, having a total abortion ban is not good for women's health. There are many, many articles out there detailing the horrific responses after abortion was wholesale banned, which often does include medically necessary abortions. Even when medically necessary abortions are not banned, doctors are often so scared or intimidated of losing their licenses or even hospitals that they won't allow you to perform them.
Yeah.
So even if that were theoretically still available, people are too afraid to perform a medically necessary abortion.
Right.
Also, if the concern were really about women's health, then there would be a more concerted effort to make sure that women are getting health care no matter what. But that is also not the case, because if you get sent to a hospital and you're in the process of giving birth or like you need treatment immediately, the hospital cannot send you away and they have to send you to somewhere else.
Yeah.
These same parties that were worried about people's health were trying to dismantle that very law because they were afraid that it would lead to women in the process of having an abortion being aided and abetted in getting an abortion, which has then resulted in these other problems. They would also be more concerned about making sure that women just have health care because, as I said, while you were in the middle of your like very real experience, a lot of women don't have health care.
Yeah.
Like, or you don't have access to adequate health care, or you can't see a doctor, or like we covered previously when we were talking about birth rates, it's so insanely expensive to give birth to a baby, and that is not subsidized for you. If you really cared about women's health care, then you would be talking to women.
Yes.
Notably, I don't see that.
As far as the healthcare goes, I call my son my bargain baby because I had him for a fraction of the cost that my friends back in the States are having their babies. It's crazy. You know, it's just, there we go again. It's crazy.
I know. We're just creeping back.
On that note, that's it for today's news report. I'm Hannah Valinsky.
I'm Amanda Stevens.
Thanks for joining us on air today. I know we had a lot of opinions to express.
We'll keep having them.
Yes, we will, for better or for worse. Tune in tomorrow for more programs by Radio Taiwan International. And in the meantime, remember to stop scrolling and touch grass. We'll see you next week.